Who are our greatest presidents? What lessons can the modern-day business leader learn from our 46 chiefs of state? Find out in this podcast series with Tom Fox and Richard Loomis to delve into the great and not-so-great presidents to mine their successes and failures for today's business executive.
Richard Loomis is currently on assignment, so in this episode I take a solo look at the presidency and presidential leadership lessons of Zachary Taylor, our 12th president. Zachary Taylor had a distinguished career in the military before he became the 12th president of the United States from 1849 until his death in 1850. During his career, he rose to the rank of Major General and became a national hero as a result of his military victories in the Mexican-American War, largely along the Texas-Mexico border. As a result, he won election to the White House despite having vague political beliefs. His top priority as president was the preservation of the... He died 16 months into his term, having made no progress on the most divisive issue in Congress and the nation, and that, of course, was slavery. Zachary Taylor was born into a prominent family of plantation owners who moved westward from Virginia to Louisville, Kentucky in his youth. He was the last president born before the adoption of the Constitution. He was commissioned as an officer in the U.S. Army in 1808 and made a name for himself as a captain in the War of 1812. He climbed the ranks of the military, establishing forts along the Mississippi River and entering the Black Hawk War as a colonel in 1832. His success in the Second Seminole War attracted national attention and earning him the nickname Old Rough and Ready. In 1845, during the annexation of Texas, President James K. Polk dispatched Taylor to the Rio Grande River in anticipation with a battle with Mexico over the disputed Texas-Mexico border. Texas said the border was the Rio Grande, and Mexico said it was much further north on the Nueces River. The Mexican-American War broke out in April 1846, and Taylor defeated Mexican troops commanded by General Aristia at the battles of Palo Alto and Rascasa de la Palma, driving Arista's troops out of Texas. Taylor then led his troops into Mexico, where they defeated Mexican troops commanded by Pedro de Ampudia at the Battle of Monterrey. Defying orders, Taylor led his troops further south, and despite being severely outnumbered, he dealt a crushing blow to Mexican forces under General Antonio de Lopez de Santa Anna at the Battle of Buena Vista. Taylor's troops were subsequently transferred to the command of Major General Winfield Scott, but Taylor retained his popularity. The Whig political party convinced a reluctant Taylor to lead their national ticket in the 1848 presidential election. Despite his unclear political tenets and indeed his overall lack of interest in politics. At the Whig National Convention, Taylor defeated Winfield Scott and former Senator of Kentucky Henry Clay for the party's nomination. He won the general election alongside New York politician Millard Fillmore, defeating Democratic Party candidates Lewis Cass of Michigan and William Butler, as well as a third-party effort by former President Martin Van Buren and Charles Adams of the Free Soil Party. Taylor became the first president to be elected without having served in a prior political office. As president, Taylor kept his distance from Congress and indeed even his own cabinet, even though partisan tensions threatened to divide the Union. Debate over the status of slavery in the Mexican Quezon, or rather secession, dominated the national political agenda and led to threats of secession from Southerners. Despite being a Southerner and slaveholder himself, Taylor did not push for the expansion of slavery and sought sectional harmony above all other concerns. To avoid the issue of slavery, he urged settlers in New Mexico and California to bypass the territorial stage and draft constitutions for statehood, setting the stage for the Compromise of 1850. Unfortunately, Zachary Taylor died suddenly of a stomach disease on July 9, 1850, with his administration having accomplished little aside from the ratification of the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. Vice President Fillmore assumed the presidency and served the remainder of his term. While historians and scholars have traditionally ranked Taylor in the bottom quartile of U.S. presidents, owing to largely to his short term, he has been described as a more forgettable president than a failed president. Unfortunately, many believe this was really the last chance to save the Union through political leadership, that Taylor, because of his national stature, could have done so, but of course his untimely death cut that possibility. A word on Taylor's death. It seems that during the 1850 July 4th celebration, Taylor consumed a large number of cherries, ice cream, and milk. He subsequently came down with a severe stomach ache, which turned into something called cholera morbus. There is still considerable debate over whether his doctors actually killed him with their treatment or if he died from the intestinal ailment. Unfortunately, a common occurrence in the 19th century. Oddly enough, many of his cabinet members came down with the very same symptoms, so it seems likely it was due to the sanitation in Washington, D.C. at the time. So what are some of the leadership lessons for the modern-day business executives that we can take away from the short tenure of the presidency of Zachary Taylor? Number one, take a stand. And this leadership lesson comes from Inaction by Zachary Taylor. It began before he was even elected president, when he did not embrace the Whig political platform or even declare himself a Whig until February 1848, with the election only 7 months away. This seems odd, but it led to other consistent actions in his presidency. For leaders, however, the clear import is sometimes you have to take a public stand, and if you want to be president of the United States in a two-party system, you certainly have to declare for one of those parties. This failure to take stands was reflected in his presidential leadership style, in which he attempted to stand above the fray. The reality was he did not lead either the Whig Party or Congress directly. He thought the president should stand above party politics, even to the extent of not taking a public stand and declaring himself a Whig. Still, for leadership, the clear message is that sometimes you do have to take a stand. Number two, you must be engaged. As a business leader, Taylor's military training influenced his thinking, but that training and those instincts did not serve him as president. He needed to lead both the country and the Whig Party. Obviously, this was a crucial time in American politics, with a horrific war only 10 years away. Further, in a time where politics was driven largely by patronage, Taylor failed to grasp this principle, and it was one of the contributing factors to the demise of the Whig Party in only 4 more years. A philosophy of trying to be above the fray does not always work. As a CEO, senior executive, or board of directors, you must be engaged in your business. It does not mean you have to get into the weeds of every tactical decision made, but you must set the proper tone and then oversee it going forward. Number 3, succession planning. We have observed several times before about the failure to plan for succession. In this case, we have that failure from a president who died in office some 18 months into his presidency. Taylor and his vice president, Millard Fillmore, did not even meet in person until only a week or two before the inauguration, so there was no time to build up any sort of personal relationship. Taylor had not brought Fillmore into any discussions around critical legislation, even though he was a part of the cabinet. This lack of engagement with Fillmore, if not to consult, at least air out his thoughts and let him know which way he was thinking about issues, was a critical failure. This was most critical around the important piece of legislation at the time, the Compromise of 1850, which was designed to allow California to come into the U.S. as a free state, created territory status for New Mexico and Utah, all in exchange for strengthening laws around fugitive slaves and protecting the rights of slave ownership. Taylor seemed to indicate that he would veto any such law, while Fillmore, as his vice president, had said he would vote for the bill if it came before him in his role as president of the Senate, and his vote was required to break a tie from that chamber. Number 4, conflicts of interest. As a leader, you must be attuned to and stop conflicts of interest by your senior management team. There was never any allegation that Taylor was personally corrupt. However, during the latter days of his administration, there was the Galphin affair. Before joining the Taylor cabinet, the Secretary of War, George Crawford, had served as a lawyer and then been involved in a 15-year lawsuit. During this lawsuit, he represented the descendants of a colonial trader who worked for Great Britain but had not been repaid at the time of the American Revolution. In the treaty ending the First War with Britain, the British debt to Galphin was assumed by the U.S. government. But over the years, the Galphin heirs had only received payment on the debt's principals. Even after years of litigation, they had never received any interest payments. Taylor's Treasury Secretary, supported by the Attorney General, agreed to the payment of interest in April 1950. To Taylor's great embarrassment, this payment included a compensation of nearly $100,000 to the President's Secretary of War for his fee as counsel for the Galphins during this time. The terms of this settlement meant that 2 cabinet members had effectively offered a huge amount from the U.S. Treasury to a third member of the U.S. cabinet. The House of Representatives expressed disapproval of his accepting the payment, and it complicated the end of Taylor's term in office. Clearly, we had a conflict of interest by one of the decision makers in the judgment to approve the repayment, and there was no segregation of duties involved in this decision. This was a huge scandal at the time. I would once again emphasize that Taylor was never a part of the discussion of the scandal, and he was even moving towards reorganizing his cabinet at the time of the scandal, yet the damage was done. Or as Andre Agassi reminds us, image is everything, and perception is reality. If you are perceived to have a scandalous cabinet, that is what people believe. Taylor allowed this to happen literally at his feet. The amount of $100,000 in 1850 translates into about $10 million now. That was a very large chunk of money then, and it's an equally huge scandal. So it turns out there are some interesting leadership lessons from the short presidency of Zachary Taylor. I hope you'll join me again next week where we continue to look at business leadership lessons from U.S. presidents. Presidential Leadership Lessons was recently awarded by the Communicators as a podcast of distinction, and we're certainly thrilled to have won that award. Also, I would like to invite you to another podcast I recently concluded called Never the Same, which looks at business issues which have changed forever in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.